On Christmas Eve, the town of Silverpine, nestled among snow-covered mountains, looked as if it had stepped straight out of a fairy tale. The lights from the houses glowed warmly, reflecting on frosted windows, while snowflakes fell like tiny shimmering crystals, blanketing everything in white. The only sound to be heard was the wind, carrying the scent of burning firewood from chimneys and the distant chime of the local church bells. But not everyone shared in the magic of the evening. In the last house on Evergreen Street, secluded from the rest of the neighborhood, George Miller, a 56-year-old man, gazed out the window, holding a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Since losing his wife, Mary, nearly a decade ago, Christmas had become a bitter reminder of her absence. His two children, Mark and Emily, lived far away, consumed by their families and careers. George never complained. He preferred to think that the distance protected him from further heartbreak. "Let's head to bed, Daisy. We've had enough Christmas for today," he said to his golden retriever. Normally lively, Daisy seemed restless that night. She pawed at the door, ears alert. George shook his head, blaming her unease on the distant sound of fireworks or the icy winds rattling the house. It was nearly midnight when an unexpected sound broke the night's stillness. Loud, frantic knocking echoed through the house, freezing George in place. Who could be out there in this remote area on such a night? Daisy began to growl, a rare reaction from the usually gentle dog. With hesitation, George made his way to the door, his heart pounding. When he opened it, he was met with the sight of a thin man, disheveled and covered in snow. The stranger trembled uncontrollably, his lips a bluish purple from the cold. "Please, sir, help me. I'm lost and freezing. I have nowhere else to go," the man pleaded, his voice shaky. He introduced himself as Tom, but his appearance was a mix of desperation and something George couldn't quite place. A peculiar glint in his eyes seemed to cut through any resistance George might have had. George hesitated. Something felt off about the man, but it was Christmas. What could he do? Letting him freeze to death wasn't an option. "Come in before you die out there," George said gruffly, masking his uncertainty. As Tom warmed himself by the fire, George prepared a bowl of hot soup. Daisy, however, remained on edge, sitting close to George with a low, continuous growl, as if issuing a warning. George tried to relax, but Daisy's behavior only deepened his unease. "Did you have an accident?" George asked, handing the soup to Tom. The man offered a strange smile before answering. "Yes, my car skidded off the road back in the woods. I've been trying to find help ever since," he said, but his voice was halting, almost calculated. George noticed holes in the story. Why hadn't he gone to the nearest town? Why choose a house so far off the main road? Even so, George tried not to judge. He sat in his armchair, watching as Tom devoured the soup. "Do you live alone here?" the stranger asked, his eyes scanning the room. A chill ran through George, not from the cold, but from something else. "It's just me and Daisy," George replied, unsure why he was revealing such details. Tom nodded, a smile on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. As the night wore on, George grew increasingly uneasy in his own home. He suggested Tom sleep on the couch, but something about the man continued to unsettle him. Daisy, normally the first to approach visitors, stayed on high alert, ears pinned back and gaze fixed on the stranger. When George finally went to his bedroom, Daisy followed closely, still emitting low growls. Around 3 a.m, George was jolted awake by Daisy's furious barking. He rushed downstairs, his heart pounding, only to find the house enveloped in silence. Everything seemed in place, except for the unsettling feeling that something had changed. Back in his room, he locked the door and lay down, though sleep eluded him. Staring at the ceiling, he tried to push away the troubling thoughts. This Christmas, he thought, was going to be different. There was a shadow over the night, A strange unease he couldn't quite explain, but it hung over him like a bad omen. The next morning, George woke with a strange heaviness, as though he'd slept under a weight pressing down on his chest. The weak sunlight barely illuminated the grey sky, and snow continued to fall, erasing any trace of movement from the night before. Daisy lay at the foot of the bed, ears lowered, a behavior George rarely saw. Slowly, he got up, a knot tightening in his stomach. When he descended the stairs, he found Tom sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee he'd apparently prepared himself. George frowned. He didn't appreciate people helping themselves to his things without permission, but he held back his annoyance. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. "Like a rock," Tom replied with a smile that bordered on mocking. "You have a cozy home, George. It must be nice living out here, far from everything with no one to bother you." George ignored the remark and poured himself a cup of coffee. Something about Tom's tone felt off, but he decided not to engage. Daisy, however, kept her distance, her gaze fixed on Tom, as if anticipating something to happen. As his coffee grew cold in his hands, George casually asked, "You mentioned an accident last night. Are you planning to head to town today? Maybe get help for your car?" Tom shrugged, glancing out the window. "No rush. The snow's heavier than yesterday. I figure it's safer to stay here until the weather clears up." The response unsettled George. He hadn't offered more than one night of shelter, but Tom was acting as though he had every right to stay indefinitely. Worse, Tom began asking increasingly personal questions, prying into areas George preferred to keep private. "You live here alone, don't you? I mean, besides the dog. It must get lonely, especially this time of year. Don't you miss having someone around, sharing your life with someone?" His tone was casual, but his eyes seemed to scrutinize George, weighing his every reaction. "I manage just fine," George replied curtly, shutting down the conversation. He got up to tend to Daisy and opened the back door to let her into the yard. That's when he noticed something strange, footprints in the snow. Not just the ones he and Tom had left, but others, coming from different directions and circling the house. Frowning, George shut the door and turned to Tom. "Did you see anyone outside last night?" Tom looked up, feigning confusion. "No, why? Something wrong?" "Footprints in the snow. Maybe they're from animals, but they look human," George said, studying Tom's reaction closely. The man merely offered a dismissive smile. "Probably kids from the neighborhood playing around. Or maybe it's just your imagination, George. Loneliness can do that to people." The final remark hit George like an insult. He chose not to respond, though irritation simmered inside him. He felt as though he was being toyed with, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly how. Later, as he inspected the house, George discovered something even more alarming. His wallet lay open on the table, something he knew he hadn't done. When he checked, he found some money missing. Not a large amount, but enough to stoke his suspicions. Taking a deep breath to calm himself, George decided to confront Tom directly. "My wallet was open and some money's gone," George said, crossing his arms. Tom raised his hands in mock innocence, though his smile faded, replaced by a cold expression. "Are you accusing me, George? I thought you were a generous man, especially at Christmas." "I just want to understand what's happening. My house, my rules," George said firmly. Tom let out a dry laugh, stepping closer with deliberate slowness. "Rules. That's funny, George. You've isolated yourself here with your dog, your memories. Do you really think rules will protect you from what truly haunts you?" The words hit George like a punch. Who was this man? How did he dare speak like that in his house? Before George could respond, Tom turned and walked out onto the porch as if he had won some invisible battle. George decided he'd had enough. He knew he had been foolish to let this stranger in. That night, he locked every door and window, determined to ask Tom to leave at dawn. Yet, as the wind howled outside and Daisy growled softly in the corner of the bedroom, George began to wonder if the situation was as simple as he hoped. Who was Tom? And what did he really want? Alone. George woke up in the early hours to Daisy barking furiously downstairs. The sound echoed through the house, cutting through the silence of the night. His heart raced as he hurriedly grabbed the flashlight from his bedside table. With careful steps, he descended the stairs, hearing the wind rushing through an opening that shouldn't have been there. When he reached the living room, he found the back door wide open, icy wind invading the house. Daisy stood at the threshold, her fur bristling, growling at something George couldn't see in the darkness of the yard. He slammed the door shut, locking it, and began checking the rooms. Tom was nowhere to be found. "Tom?" George called out, but only the sound of the wind replied. He felt a mix of relief and apprehension. On one hand, he was glad the stranger had left. On the other, he couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. Looking out the kitchen window, George saw fresh footprints in the snow. He grabbed his coat, put on boots, and stepped outside, following the tracks that led toward the forest surrounding the property. The flashlight illuminated the path, revealing tall, snow-covered trees and a silence that felt oppressive. As he walked, he noticed something odd. The footprints weren't from just one person. They appeared to be from multiple individuals, as if Tom wasn't alone. His mind tried to find rational explanations, but unease grew with every step. After about 10 minutes, George came upon what seemed to be a small, makeshift campsite. An extinguished fire and a few simple belongings were scattered on the ground. But what caught his attention was a red scarf embroidered with the name Mary resting on a stone. He froze. It was his late wife's scarf, which he had kept locked away in a box in the basement. George picked up the scarf with trembling hands, trying to understand how it had ended up there. He began rummaging through the items at the campsite, but found nothing that explained the mystery. Instead, his search was interrupted by a sound from the trees, the snap of branches breaking. He spun around, the flashlight shaking in his hand. "Tom, is that you?" he shouted, but there was no response. Silence returned, heavy and oppressive. George decided to head back home. Something was wrong, and he needed to prepare for whatever was happening. When he got back, he found Daisy agitated, barking at the living room window. Looking outside, George saw a figure moving toward the woods. It was impossible to make out who it was, but the gait seemed familiar. It could have been Tom. George decided to act. He picked up the phone to call the police, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was weak, which was unusual for the area. Frustrated, he tried the old radio he kept for emergencies, but even that was dead. Isolated and cut off, George realized he was alone in this situation. His mind began racing, searching for answers in the past. Was Tom a thief he had underestimated, or was something deeper at play? As he checked the house to make sure everything was locked, he noticed some items were out of place. His grandfather's pocket watch and Mary's antique brooch were missing. Anger bubbled up, mixed with fear. It felt as though his home was being violated, not just physically, but emotionally. Then he heard heavy footsteps on the porch. George grabbed a wooden bat he kept in the pantry and approached the door, his heart pounding. Before he could open it, he heard Tom's voice from the other side. "George, did you really think you could escape the consequences of your choices? Sometimes Christmas gives us what we deserve, not what we wish for." The words chilled George to his core. He flung the door open, but found nothing. The snow on the ground was undisturbed, with no footprints to suggest anyone had been there. He stepped back, confused, feeling as though he were being pulled into a game he didn't understand. Returning to the living room, George found an envelope on the table. He didn't remember seeing it before. With trembling hands, he opened it to find a single handwritten sentence. "What you keep in the basement might be more than just memories." The message made George rush to the basement. He unlocked the door and descended the creaking stairs, Daisy close behind. The flashlight illuminated the space, revealing shelves filled with old boxes. He found the box where he kept Mary's belongings and opened it hurriedly. The red scarf wasn't there, but something else caught his eye. A torn photograph he didn't recall ever seeing. In the picture, he and Mary were smiling in front of the house, but in the background stood a man whose presence felt out of place. The man's face was familiar. It was Tom. George froze, trying to comprehend how this was possible. He couldn't remember where he knew the man from, but something about his expression carried a weight of judgment, as if Tom had been present during a pivotal moment in George's life that he now struggled to recall. Suddenly, Daisy began barking frantically, interrupting George's thoughts. The shadow of a man passed quickly across the basement window, and George knew the situation was far from over. He rushed upstairs, determined to face whatever was out there. The atmosphere of threat intensified, and George felt the night would not end without a revelation that would change everything. The dawn brought a deceptive calm to Silverpine. The snow had stopped, and the first rays of sunlight reflected off the pristine white blanket covering George's yard. However, within the walls of his secluded home, the tension lingered. George felt like a taut rope stretched to its limit, every sound amplified by the surrounding silence. He spent the last few hours rummaging through memories, trying to understand who Tom was and why the stranger seemed so familiar. The photo found in the basement still lay on the living room table. The man in the background, undeniably Tom, seemed to carry an inexplicable presence. While feeding Daisy, George noticed something peculiar. The footprints he had seen the night before, leading to and from the woods, had vanished under the fresh snow. It was as if no one had ever been there. He closed his eyes and rubbed his temples, trying to push away thoughts that were beginning to feel like madness. Determined to bring an end to it, George went outside to check the house's surroundings one more time. With the flashlight now unnecessary in the daylight, he returned to the spot where he had found the makeshift campsite. To his surprise, everything had disappeared. No tracks, no extinguished fire, no Mary's scarf. It was as if the previous night had been a feverish dream. As he returned home, George noticed Daisy standing on the porch, staring intently at the back door. A chill ran through him as he climbed the steps and heard the familiar voice that had haunted him through the night. "You cannot escape, George." He quickly turned to the door, but the house was empty. The words seemed to echo inside his mind, an accusation carrying the weight of something deeper. Sitting in the living room chair, George looked at the photo again, this time allowing his mind to explore memories long buried. Tom's figure began to make sense, but in a way George didn't want to accept. Decades earlier, when he was a young man trying to balance work and family, George had been involved in a car accident. A rainy night, a poorly calculated curve, and he had collided with another vehicle. He had survived with no serious injuries, but the other driver, a man he never got to know, had not been so fortunate. At the time, George had avoided responsibility, using his family's money to manipulate the situation and escape legal consequences. Tom, George realized, wasn't a stranger. He was the face of that buried past, now materialized in a way that defied reality. Mary's scarf, the torn photo, the disappearing footprints, it all pointed to something bigger, a reckoning brought to his doorstep this Christmas. "Why now?" George murmured, staring into the void. The words felt like an apology. He felt the weight of his choices, the lives he had affected, and the years spent hiding in solitude. Suddenly, Daisy began barking again, this time at the fireplace. George approached cautiously, feeling the heat of the fire that had reignited on its own. In the flames, a vague figure began to take shape, not entirely human, but undeniably aware. It was Tom. "You've run for too long, George," the figure said with a voice that seemed to come from both within and outside George's mind. "But Christmas isn't just about forgiveness, it's about accountability. The time has come for you to face the consequences." The words reverberated through George. He felt a mix of fear and acceptance. He finally understood that he could no longer keep running. Closing his eyes, he braced himself for what was to come. When he opened them again, the figure was gone, leaving only the ordinary flames in the fireplace. However, on the table, there was another envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "Forgiveness begins when you forgive yourself. Find them and make it right." Next to the note was an address. It was for a small nearby town, where George knew the family of the man he had hurt years ago still lived. With a heavy yet determined heart, George realized his journey wasn't over. He needed to fix what he had broken, not just with that family, but also within himself. Later that day, as the sun set and the night returned with its elongated shadows, George fed Daisy and looked out the window one last time. For the first time in many years, he felt a different kind of calm, a spark of hope. He knew that whatever had happened on that Christmas night wasn't just a nightmare, but a call to something greater. Sitting in his armchair, holding Mary's photo in his hands, he murmured to himself, "Christmas isn't about what we've lost, but about what we can still rebuild." And in the distance, in the glow of the stars scattered across the snowy sky, there seemed to be a silent approval.